Good afternoon, everyone. Try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Alita Williams, and I am the president of the Rotary Club of Chicago, and I would like to open our 5,701 meeting of the club. And if Shada could come up and give us a thought of the day.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody that's on Zoom as well. Thank you for Tom Sylvia for the presenter today. Today we have a privilege of welcoming a truly exceptional speaker to our club, Father John. In the light of his visit, I would like to share a few thoughts of the relationship between faith and science. Faith and science often seen as different paths, but together illuminate the full spectrum of human understanding. Which science explains how of the universe, faith seeks to answer the why. By embracing both, we can foster a more holistic view of our existence, appreciating the mysteries of the creation while striving to uncover its truth. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Alita. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. You have slides? Nope, wrong slide. We changed the slide layout for Eric and forgot to tell him. Small technical difficulties, it's okay. Well, no worries. So coming up, we have our annual kayak river cleanup on June 9th. So if anyone would love to come out, it's one of our most favorite service projects that we do. It's also time for us to finish up the dictionary project that we do every year. So we go out to Chicago public schools and we give a dictionary to third graders. And each student in the room gets their own dictionary with a beautiful sticker inside that they can write their name on, with the Rotary 4-way test. And it's such a great opportunity for us to give back to schools, give back to students, and those students truly enjoy getting that dictionary. Every time I've done it, there's always at least 2 or 3 kids in the room, and they go, "Do I have to share this with my brother and sister?" And I go, "No, it's all yours," and they're so excited. And for a lot of them, it's their first book that they get that's theirs. And so that's why we choose third grade. On June 17th, we'll be packing art kits for the Snow City Arts program that we've done over the last couple of years. And a new service project we've started is the spectrum sailing for kids on the autism spectrum. So you will be able to help kids on the autism spectrum with learning how to sail on Lake Michigan. So that's June 18th through the 20th. And looking ahead, we have the Blues Kid of the Year for the Fernando Jones Blues Camp. We also will be helping at the Jesse White Trunk Party in July. I believe it's July 13th and 14th, where we give out 500 trunks to students going off to college. Many of them are still the first people in their families going off to college. So, there we are. That's the kayak. And then, and we fill up those trunks full of everything that they need to go off to school: pillows, blankets, a sheet set, toiletries, school supplies, books, everything that they need to get ready to go off to college. Kind of all the little things that we forget about when you're ready to go to college, that big bag of stuff you have to pack up. And for a lot of students, that's a big financial hardship. So we try to help bridge that gap for them to be ready to go off to school. The Square Roots Music Festival is looking for volunteers July 12th through the 14th. If we get 10 people to volunteer, then we get a donation back to our foundation. So we really need people to get together and go sign up. A link will be coming out, and when you register, you just need to say you're with the Rotary Club of Chicago. And lastly, the Still Point Theater Collective, they do theater classes for senior citizens, and so we'll be able to go out and help be a part of those classes also. Okay, and with that, we have a wonderful speaker today. I'm very excited to hear. Can we all please honor everyone's time and keeping our questions succinct and one per person, which we really have a hard time with, but we're going to work on that, Rotarians. We will take all questions at the end of the remarks. Everyone in the room, please wait until the microphone comes to you so those on Zoom can hear you. Everyone on Zoom, if you can please put your questions into the chat and we'll make sure to get to you. And then with that, I invite Tom Silva to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Alita. I hope you guys will indulge me a little bit because this is one of my very favorite topics, which is this intersection between philosophy, science, and faith. Even through your hardest days, remember that we are all made of stardust. So said Carl Sagan very famously. And so this is the miracle, right, of the creation story that science has given us. The universe created 14 billion years ago. The stars created 200 million years later, nucleosynthesizing all of the elements and then flinging them into the heavens where they form the planets, and then single cell and then multicellular life. Astonishing. Think of this, any element in your body heavier than iron has traveled through at least one supernova. But the question isn't just where we come from. It's also, how does the knowledge about our origins, what does it tell us about the way we should live? The energy inside of us, our responsibility to each other and to our planet, from the cosmic to the terrestrial. And this is the work not only of scientists, but also of philosophers, and yes, our sadhus, our imams, our rabbis, and our priests. And sometimes these are the same people. So I want to offer you one example, somebody you may not be familiar with. Father John and I talked about him. Georges Lemaitre is considered the father of the Big Bang Theory. He received his PhD in physics from MIT at the turn of the century. He was also a Catholic priest. And he pioneered the notion that we all know well today, which is that the universe is expanding. Lemaitre, to his credit, under great pressure from the church, would not bend. And he kept his faith and his science entirely separate. He treated them as different parallel interpretations of the world, both of which he believed with equal conviction. Remarkable. So when Marga Huco, dear Marga, our colleague here, who is now in Singapore at the global conference, and I first hatched the idea for this talk, I hoped that we would find somebody who had a similar bio to Georges Lemaitre, and I cannot think of anyone better than Father John. Father John Kjarte was ordained a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago in 2002 and serves as rector of Mundelein Seminary and president of the University of St. Mary of the Lake. He holds degrees in mathematics and physics from the University of Chicago, where he also earned his PhD in astrophysics. He also has a doctorate in sacred theology from Catholic University of America. I am very pleased to introduce Father John Kjarte.
This comes out. I never met a podium that I liked, so my father's wandering spirit. We'll see if this works. But thank you very much, and it's just such a joy to be here. You know, about Georges Lemaitre, he was Belgian, unless you think that this guy was some egghead in an ivory tower or locked up in some, office in Rome. He was actually also a frontline soldier during the First World War, and very tragically, was a witness to the first use of poison gas. So just an incredibly complex, yet very humble man. Okay, seem to have lost our slides. Oops. Okay. So I'm not going to really get into some of the really sublime topics that were just mentioned here. They are fascinating, but in the interest of our own time, what I want to focus on is just something really very pragmatic, if I can put it that way. And while so much gets said about the dialogue between faith and science, I think if there's one area in that dialogue that isn't utilized nearly as much as it might be, is that the way scientists look at the world, in particular the way scientists engage mystery, I think could be of great help to the way people of faith perhaps, explore the questions that move them and excite them. And what I'm going to say is not unique to any particular faith tradition, but if you want to talk about a faith tradition, you are at least acknowledging as a working hypothesis that there is something beyond, above, extra to the world that we see and interact with every day. But that doesn't mean it's not quantifiable. It doesn't mean it's not discernible, right? I may be very fond of unicorns, but that's neither faith nor science because there's not a whole lot I can tell you about them. So as you might know, the James Webb Telescope is really getting a lot of attention in the news today. And I'd like to suggest that, because of my own background, a lot of what I talk about is going to come out of the physical sciences, but could equally apply it to other areas. But the Webb telescope is the latest of the so-called great telescopes that NASA has put up. Think of the Hubble telescope, probably the best known predecessor to the Webb telescope. And the reason I think it's kind of the poster object for the faith-science dialogue is a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's the product of incredible longing and intentionality. By the time one of these telescopes go up, and by the way, this is $10 billion of your tax money hard at work, it's the product of decades, literally, right? It's somebody having the idea, usually pretty early in their career, maybe even graduate school or undergraduate, and then putting together this amazing global, right? Rotarians, you understand this probably better than any government agency, what it means to draw on resources worldwide, economic resources, especially intellectual resources, collaboration. And at any point along the way, this project could fizzle out. The only reason it keeps advancing from one stage to the next is because people who well realize they may not see the ultimate fruition of the idea. Plenty of scientists worked for years on the Webb telescope and left this earth long before it was actually launched. But there's this profound belief that the searching, right, the enterprise of moving forward is worth the investment. And I would argue that for someone who really cares about questions of faith, even if they're just seeking, even if they're agnostics who just feel like there's something there they can't ignore, unless and until they're willing to devote themselves, right, to commitment, to exploration, to dealing with disappointments and setbacks, they really don't have the right to form a conclusion. Just like a scientist doesn't have a right to form a conclusion about infrared astronomy unless they're willing to explore it and look at it. The other thing I just want to say is the Webb telescope, I don't know if anyone remembers when it was launched. As often is the case, there was a launch date, it was put back, bad weather, da-da-da-da. It finally launched on Christmas morning It's kind of a fun topic, at least for Christians. Some homilies write themselves, and I got off very easy that Christmas. So the Webb telescope, wonderful example of commitment, longing, searching. I'm obviously coming out of the Catholic tradition, but there's nothing here that's unique to that, except that John Paul II, you might remember a pope couple before Pope Francis we have today, was easily the religious leader of his time that was most committed to the faith-science dialogue. And I remember I was a graduate student when he delivered a famous address to the director of the Vatican Observatory. If you don't know this, the Vatican actually operates an observatory. It goes back hundreds of years. Originally, it was in Rome when you could actually see something at night from Rome. Now you can't do that. So the working science is done out of the University of Arizona. The Vatican is part operator of the observatory of the University of Arizona. But he came out with what has become a seminal document on the faith-science dialogue. And you probably can't read that from the back, but let me just read it for you. Part of this letter, it says, both religion and science must preserve their own autonomy and their distinctiveness. Each should possess its own principles, its pattern of procedures, its diversities of interpretation, and its own conclusions. Neither ought to assume that it forms a necessary premise for the other. So in other words, there ought to be mutual respect here. Each has its own area, its own wheelhouse, so to speak, and that's just the way we should move forward. Now, John Paul II certainly doesn't need my help, but I'm going to offer it. I remember at the time thinking, we can say more than this. We can say more than simply, we shouldn't try to go at each other's throats. We shouldn't sort of be two respectful ships that kind of pass in the night. If a scientist believes what she or he says they believe, then there's nothing in the universe that is off limits to them. I've never known a good scientist. I've known plenty of bad scientists, and I've probably been one of them at various times. But a good scientist cares about everything. And any question of faith that might come up, whether that scientist believes in God or not, is something worth exploring, something worth talking about, something worth saying to the believer, if this is what you really believe, then what does this look like? Why do you care about it? Don't just give me some vague abstraction. A scientist really wants to know whether she believes in God or not. And similarly for a theologian, a good theologian cares about everything. What part of theologos, doesn't cover everything in the universe that could be considered? And so consequently, if there's a theologian who says, oh, you scientists, you go off to the lab and do your thing. You think you can reduce everything to chemicals. I'm not interested in what you're up to. That's a lousy theologian, and we shouldn't let them off the hook. Because if a theologian really believes what she says she believes, then whatever it is the scientist is interested in falls under the purview of the theos, whose logos she claims to be interested in. So you can do bad theology and you can do bad science, but good theology and good science are intimately interested, at least at a conceptual level. We all specialize, I get that. Otherwise, we'd never get grants, right? Okay. But faith and science, a matter of focusing. So if you go away with nothing else today, I would try to get across, and this is what I often say to students, what science contributes to faith is that it helps hone the practice of the theologian. And what I mean by that is good science, right? It can focus the questions that theologians pose. A lot of questions theologians express, at least in the traditional sense, well, Thomas Aquinas posed them, or St. Augustine posed them, or whomever. But we know a lot more about the world today than Thomas Aquinas did in the 13th century, or Augustine did in his century. And so as we learn more about the world, you can take certain timeless questions like, well, what is goodness? What is truth? Obviously, philosophers thought about these things. But once again, a good philosophical question is also a worthy theological question. And good science can focus the interpretation of the answers that theologians derive. Science can hone both the questions and the understanding of the answers. As we move on from one generation to the next, we're always gaining new amounts of information that can help hone these sorts of questions. And we'll say more about that in a minute. But it's worth bearing in mind that at the end of the day, you can boil down what science is relatively basically, right? And if we can't do this, then we probably don't know what we're talking about. So obviously, there's all sorts of complexity once you wade into a particular field, but by and large, there's three basic components. Empirical data, right? You've got to have something that you're considering, whether those are grains of sand or the iron atoms we just heard about, or experience of the divine. If you tell me you've had profound experience of the divine, or cosmic nature, whatever you want to call it, well, that's something to be considered. So you have empirical data, and then you have some sort of explanatory theory, right? You have some way of trying to make sense out of what's in front of you. And even if what you have in front of you can't yet make sense of, that just makes clear the fact that you have some prior theory, and this just doesn't fit into it. If you don't have some way of trying to understand what's in front of you, you're just not thinking very clearly. And then finally, and this is something scientists don't often reflect on, and here's where theology is very helpful to science, because a good philosopher or theologian, if they are good, can recognize what are my biases, what am I coming at as an underlying presupposed worldview, but a sort of non-empirical worldview. By non-empirical, that doesn't mean not true, but it's something we're born into, and we barely give it a second thought. Now, let's illustrate this with a very complicated example. So I hope you've digested your food. I don't know what your weather was like yesterday, but we had terrible storms in the northwest suburbs, really the worst storms we've had this season. And at certain times, there was a bright flash of light in the sky and then this pounding noise, right? Well, there's some empirical data for you. That's what we experience today. That's what they would have experienced in the Middle Ages. That's what they would have experienced in prehistoric times, empirical data. Now, each one of those eras would have a different theoretical model for trying to understand what's going on. I need to have some way of thinking about what's going on. And a lot of times that theoretical supposition is going to grow out of my worldview. So for us, it's pretty easy to understand where thunder comes from. I'm the youngest of 7 kids, so if you grew up with older siblings, you know how they love to lie to you, right? This is what older siblings do. So it was a long time before I learned that it wasn't due to angels bowling. We all know that's where thunder comes from. But stop for a minute, right? Not just a cute cartoon. You've got the same empirical data that the most sophisticated meteorologist might ever encounter. It's the same fundamental experience. One way of making sense of the world is that angels are doing this. They're bowling up there. Or angels are, the reason a dart goes if I throw it is that angels are pushing it. Or somehow God is a secondary or efficient cause for the philosophers here. Divine agents are just making everything do what they do. Well, what's the underlying worldview that goes with that theory? Well, it's that somehow the divine is responsible for everything that we have, that there is a God who oversees and maybe kind of micromanages everything that we have. Well, if you look at this from the context of modern meteorology, fine, you've got a theory, charge in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. What's the underlying worldview that I can use such knowledge to pretty much explain anything? If there's a phenomenon in the heavens, well, maybe meteorology can't explain it right now, but it will. I'll just wait long enough and we'll eventually get the answer. So this idea of what are your underlying worldview suppositions, which leads me to say, science is grounded on faith beliefs. Faith does not have to mean faith in God necessarily. By faith, I simply mean what are these underlying assumptions or worldview that the scientist takes on, often without even reflecting upon them. Well, here's one. The belief that the universe is orderly and rational. We often don't even give these things a second thought. So an ice crystal or a snowflake, I can look at that. I can put it under my microscope. I can touch it. I can hold it. Well, I'm going to assume that in something like an ice cube, right, much more interesting than a snowflake, especially depending on the drink it's in, I can understand that entire ice cube if I really understand that one ice crystal. Now, there's no way in the world I can go in there and meddle around with the 6 times 10 to the 23 or so ice crystals in one ice cube, but I make that assumption. If I understand ice, I can basically understand an ice cube. Well, ho-hum, who cares about that? I can now say, I can understand what's going on in a frozen lake, more or less. Well, there's no way in the world I can look at all the ice crystals in one ice cube, and I certainly can't look at all the ice in even a moderate-sized frozen lake. But that's an incredible assumption that we just don't give a lot of thought to, right? That the universe is orderly and rational. Here's another one. The order of the universe is open to the human mind, right? If you have any Kantians here, you'd love a question like this. The very fact that if I look at whatever it is a scientist might look at, or anybody else, if I consider another person, if I consider something at the other end of my telescope, the assumption that my mind has the ability to draw some sort of meaningful conclusion out of that observation is no small assumption. Again, very familiar kind of question for philosophers, but the very fact that our biology is wired that way. And then finally, belief that there is unity and uniformity across the universe. So with the ice crystal, we were thinking about the terrestrial universe. Now we're going to expand that to the cosmos, right? So that we could just hear, stated with great confidence from that very podium, you are made up of things that were cycled through a supernova. Okay, buddy, put up or shut up. What's your proof? Carl Sagan said it. But you see what I'm saying? Carl Sagan, what's the furthest that a human being has ever gone physically to pick up and touch something? How far have we gone? Where you could physically touch with the hands. Not a hard question, but so you can look at rocks here on the earth, the moon, of course. That's as far as we've gone, right? We've sent probes and so forth farther than that. So I can say, I can look at a mineral substance on Earth. I can look at some mineral substances in what is barely getting beyond the surface of the Earth. And then I'm going to draw conclusions about what's going on in the nearest galaxy, let alone something that the Webb telescope is seeing, at the edge of the observable universe. Don't worry, I promise, just 5 more minutes or the ghost of my German father will force this to end. So we won't go much longer. So these 3 assumptions: belief, the universe is orderly and rational, the universe is open to the human mind, there is unity and uniformity across the universe. Does that prove the existence of a divine creator? No, of course not. But it is consonant. It is compatible with that worldview. And I don't think you're going to get a lot of mileage, though people try to say, well, look at this or that phenomenon in the world, there must be a God. I won't deny that the amazing things we can observe in the world might reinforce someone's experience of God in their own way, but it doesn't undeniably prove that there must be a God. And I always get a little bit frustrated when you see those sorts of claims made, because I think ultimately it undercuts. Because a good scientist would say, you've shown me consonance, but I don't have to draw the same conclusion you draw. But the other thing science provides to faith is that it can demand precision and honesty. Or another way of saying it, let God be God. So one of the most common frames you're going to hear is that God, divine, whatever, is a source of unconditional love. Now, that won't be the case necessarily in every theology, but this is a fairly common one. But if that's the case, if God is a source of unconditional love, right? And sometimes we need science, or at least mathematics, to remind us that unconditional, it doesn't get any greater than that. Unconditional plus 1 is unconditional. Well, if God is unconditional love, then the scientists will stubbornly say to the theologian, you've got to be willing to tell me how that is consonant with unconditional love. Now, I don't think that those things, negate a God who is unconditionally loving. But I can't brush that under the rug. I can't just talk about warm, fuzzy experiences and say, and therefore God must be unconditionally loving. And a good scientist does not take inconvenient data and brush them under the rug. There are plenty of bad scientists who do that all the time. But if you're really going to be honest to the tradition, you have to take everything in front of you and you have to honor its existence and then let that go back to how are you understanding what you're claiming is the underlying worldview. Another thing to think about, awe and wonder. And a lot of times science is talked about in terms of awe and wonder. For me, that's often what when I'm feeling kind of downtrodden and bored, and I'm largely an administrator today, so leaky roofs and union contracts get a lot of my attention. And if I'm just feeling overwhelmed, I'll just go back and look at some of these images from the Hubble telescope or the Webb telescope. Or if you know the Walt Whitman poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, just go out on a dark night and look up. Awe and wonder. Well, something that we know from neurological studies is that these kinds of emotions are what's known as epistemic emotions, epistemology, right? Knowledge. There are literally certain emotions that literally render the brain more open to creative thinking. And that's been quantified. They give people different simple tests, how creative are you dealing with this or that puzzle or problem? And these kinds of emotions give rise to creativity. One of the things they do is they tend to relax the defense against thinking the impossible might be possible. We've always done it that way. I couldn't possibly conceive of another way. Some of these emotions like awe and wonder give rise to that kind of creative thinking. And someone like Georges Lemaitre, right, be a great example. There was nothing in this guy's world that, he wasn't injected with some sort of special brilliance drug. But if you study his life history, and there are a few really good biographies out there, you see that this was someone who, from his earliest days, had the opportunity to be infused with awe and wonder. And so scientists, as I said, are good at encountering mystery. How do you leverage the known to step into the unknown? Theologians should be doing the same thing. But I certainly have known some theologians who struggle to take that extra step if it seems uncomfortable or challenging. So for example, and I know we've got some science folks here, charge on the electron, gravitational constant, the speed of light. Those are the known qualities. And the scientists, if they see a blob on the sidewalk and they don't know what it is, they don't just throw up their hands and say, well, it must not exist because it's too hard for me to understand. They take these known qualities and is it charged? Does it weigh something? How can I use what I know to explore what I don't know, right? Laws of electricity and magnetism, gravitation. So I want to close with a little composite clip. Very famous astronomical object called the Crab Nebula. In some people's minds, this looks like a crab, so I leave it up to you. Now that we've been able to look at the universe through multiple wavelengths, right? We see the visible light with our eyes, but there's infrared radiation, there's high energy radiation, X-rays, gamma rays. Now that we've had multiple telescopes, the Webb is just the most recent. All this is doing is looking at the same object at these different wavelengths. This is in radio waves. Now we're moving into the infrared. Same object. Now optical. Here's the Hubble telescope. If you looked with the naked eye, you'd see something like this. Now we're going into high energy, ultraviolet radiation. What we're doing is we're peering into different parts of this very same body. Now very high energy, X-ray radiation. And if you put it all together, this is what you get. In St. Augustine's day, assuming they even had telescopes, all you would have seen is one slice of that. In Thomas Aquinas' day, one slice of that. In Karl Rahner's, a famous 20th century theologian's day, one slice of that. In an incredibly short, accelerated amount of time, we're seeing all through that. And what if the theologian, every time she got up and confronted mystery, whether that's the joy of a beautiful sunrise or the tragedy of a child with cancer, if we believe what we say, you're looking at that same extraordinary bit of existence through all these different layers and slices. And to think the way a scientist thinks is to simply honor every one of those facets and knowing that you don't have the right to ignore one because you favor another. So I think thinking the way a scientist thinks can be one of the greatest gifts that science gives to people of faith. So we'll end it there and I guess open to questions.
Thanks. I'm still trying to understand, pardon me. I understand that the theologian can certainly follow the scientists, but I don't understand how the scientist can say, I really do appreciate your theological position on blah, 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 and I'm willing to, it almost sounds like you're saying he's going to try and understand it, study it. How do we, I don't get the translation between theology to science.
In other words, what does theology offer to science? Sure. Well, a couple of things. At a methodological level, good theology is really quite good at exploring those underlying worldviews or assumptions, if I can put it that way, and helping scientists to realize you're working within a certain, not just physical milieu or environment, but intellectual one as well. And there are limitations, perhaps, to what you can say. So a theologian can say to a scientist, well, let's go back a few generations. You know, a theologian can say to science, well, you have to account for why is there matter that we have today? Where does this stuff even come from? You know, and the scientists would have to scratch their head and say, well, you know, it's just here. Then you move on to something like the Big Bang, and you'll find people, and Stephen Hawking was one of these, who said, well, look, you know, with the Big Bang, we can actually account for the generation of matter out of initial vacuum. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because of the laws of quantum mechanics, which we didn't know about earlier. But then the theologian can say, well, okay, but you've just kind of pushed it back another level. Why is existence itself explainable in terms of quantum physics? In other words, where do these laws come from? So the theologian can constantly be inviting the scientists to think about the ultimate origin, let alone purpose. The other thing I haven't touched on at all is the whole question of technology or the use of that science, right? These are ethical questions. Just because you discover something, that doesn't automatically answer the question, how should you use it? You know, should you push on to the next invention without thinking in advance about how it might be used? So there's the whole realm of ethical application. And so those would be a couple of things I would offer.
So this gets at that question in a slightly different way. If there was one thing you had to tell a scientist to help that scientist be a better listener when he listens to a theologian, what would you tell him?
Sure. And this largely comes out of, I mentioned, part of my deep respect for Rotary is that I walked by your huge building in Evanston every day when I was the chaplain at Northwestern. And so with a college kid, right, who are just wonderful folks to have these conversations with, maybe for some of you that's your children or grandchildren, what I would say is, tell me about love. You know, just tell me about love. Tell me how you would define it, tell me your experience of it, and tell me whom you love and why you love them. I mean, just to take a question like that seriously and start to think about it. It's tricky to define, I would argue almost impossible to completely define. You know it seemingly when you're in it, yet try to convince someone, well, what does that look like? Just to get them thinking about, you know, what does it mean? Because ultimately theology is about relationship. And as you know from your chemistry studies and so forth, today science is much more interested in relationships than in individual units oftentimes. And so, I mean, that's a whole other fascinating conversation. But I just often found a question as basic but profound as that can sometimes just give someone pause to begin to think about, well, what is it, you know, love does not exist outside of relationality. Okay, well, I can think about a lot of ways I relate to you. I mean, it might be financially, it might mean biologically, you know, and you just start unpacking those different layers. But that's a way, that would be a simple question I would pose. Because there, both the theologian and the scientists, if they're honest, are sort of sitting in humility. And it's a beautiful place to sit.
First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming and taking the time to be with us. I have to say this, just sentimentally, I had the privilege to spend several hours with Pope John Paul II before he was Pope John Paul II, when he was in Krakow.
Okay.
And then to sit in Holy Name Cathedral when he came here.
Yeah.
And preached a sermon on Acts 4:28. He used the name of the cathedral sort of for his context. There is no other name given under heaven whereby we must be saved. And so just a little shout out, what a great man he really was.
Sure.
And they only come along once in a while like that. But here's my question. American civilization, historically a Christian civilization of sorts, was rooted in both Athens and Jerusalem. The whole, what we call Western civilization, draws from two wells, Athens and Jerusalem, from that scientific, philosophical, and from the profoundly prophetic and religious. Here we are, as we sit here, and we all read the newspapers, and we really want to read a comic book immediately thereafter. Are we near the end of the Enlightenment experiment where faith and reason played off each other in very productive ways? Because as we move into a time where objective reality is under attack, and I guess where I want to go with this is to be practical. You're a scientist, you're a Christian. What do we do right now with artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence, obviously a huge area. But what I think is very helpful to remember is that artificial intelligence is grounded on whatever you want to call it, non-artificial intelligence. In other words, it grows out of, whether you look at the mining of what has been produced, and largely, that's what's going on, because we have the technology today to look at the billions and billions and billions of bits of information. And then you look for trends, you look for patterns. So I think it's always important to remember it didn't just sort of come in out of left field. Now, the tantalizing question, of course, is, and you'll hear it phrased in different ways, well, does it take on a life of its own or what have you? For me, all that really does is it forces us to think more carefully and richly about what do we mean by intelligence in the first place. Because there was a time when people would say things like, only human beings can make tools. Clearly what separates us from the animals is the use of tools. And now I'm not suggesting that worms are out using Black & Decker, but we know that there are animals that make use of basic tools. And that shouldn't frighten us, right? So playing chess, for example, right? Remember when Garry Kasparov was beaten by whatever the program was? Well, it shouldn't shock us to realize that, that's a huge database, a huge memory base, and if you can play through every conceivable move, you might get to the point where you can, beat a chess master. So for me, that just raises the interesting question of, well, what does it mean to be intelligent? And it doesn't have to mean that our humanity is somehow being denigrated. I just think, to go back to my statement, good science hones the questions that theologians pose. And so I think the science is forcing, you don't have to be a theologian, it's just forcing us as humans to think more deeply about what it means to be human. Now, having said all that, a lot of the scary stuff really has to do with the application of this, has to do with good old-fashioned ethics, which you don't need AI to think about, right? So how you can use this information and how you can use these tools is, of course, a hugely important, and I don't want to sound glib or dismissive of that. I think those are hugely important questions. But I don't personally find it threatening, something like, well, are we losing what it means to be human? I think it's forcing us to think even more carefully about what it does mean to be human. But if you didn't have a vast database of human production, you would never have artificial intelligence today. It grows and feeds off of that which is the product of human thought and production.
Oh, last. That's pressure filled. I thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated these intersections where questions are at the forefront of everything, and that we hold space for the questions and hold space for the unknown. That just very much excites me. And I've been thinking a lot about spaces like convergence points between science and spirituality. And one of the ones that really captures my attention is quantum physics and our relationship to time as a concept. And I don't have a strongly formed question, so bear with me, but I'm wondering if you have recommendations or insights or thoughts about that collision point, who's writing about that collision point, who's, encountering it right now and thinking about it. I think it's actually very adjacent to AI. This sort of idea of there being an understanding of the world beyond what we consider a concrete perception and what we're assuming is truth versus what are our possibilities.
Yeah, thank you for that incredibly rich question. My strongest recommendation to you, without a moment's hesitation, which probably means it's wrong, but is try to steer, and it's become a cottage industry of sort of quantum theology or those kinds of things, and instead look to good descriptions of the physics itself, and then use your own personal experience as a seeker, searcher, spiritual journey, whatever you're on, to dialogue with that. And the only reason I'm saying that is, unless you're listening to someone who really, really understands the complexity of the physics, and it is incredibly complex, way over my head. There's maybe a handful of people on planet Earth that are, and it doesn't mean they're exactly right, but so things like string theory, really far advanced quantum physics, and there's a guy by the name of Carlo Rovelli. Maybe he was actually a best-selling New York Times author. He's Italian, he's an avowed atheist, you ain't gonna learn nothing about God from him. But he does a wonderful job of writing in layman's terms, but not comic book terms, of what we are beginning to push the limits of on space and time. Because, thanks to Einstein, we really do see time as a kind of fourth dimension. And that's not too, you do a little algebra, you can kind of see that. But to get to the point of understanding space and time itself as quantized, so that we're really teasing out the question of what are the underlying elements of space and time themselves. Now, none of us in this room should go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But he does a nice job of helping to show that at the very least, what we think of as time, 1, 2, 3, forget about it. That's our experience, but we know that you can really measure the physical world in a way that calls that kind of understanding of time into question, and similarly with space. And so from the quantum mechanics of the 1920s and 30s already, which we are using in our phones and our watches, it's not, Star Wars stuff. That is enough to tease out the weirdness of the physical world. But if you really want to get a sense, now take that, the humility there, the flexibility, because what he's talking about really is still theory, right? With some tantalizing experimentation. And now sit with what you have more than enough of what you need, right? Just this sense of your experience of the divine or time and spirituality or whatever. And there's a whole list, obviously, of writing and theology and spirituality there. And I really mean this to say, when you let those two come together and talk with good, like folks in this room, where you can have an honest, respectful conversation. And then for me, the real focal point, is something I didn't talk about at all here, is prayer. For me, prayer is the laboratory of the spiritual seeker. If you don't pray, you don't have the right to make some conclusion about God or the divine. If you're not willing to do an experiment, you don't have the right to make a claim about the natural world. Right? Now, by prayer, I don't simply mean a caricature, right? Any more than I mean a caricature of science. So I got down on my knees and I prayed for grandma and she still died, therefore God doesn't exist. That's ridiculous. And it doesn't mean that we don't have intercessory prayer, but I mean a real mature exploration of what prayer is. Now engage in that. And I don't think we'd be here at the end of this moment of the history of humanity if that was just nonsense and there was absolutely nothing there. But for me, the underlying point isn't that there was miracle X in this century in that church, great, that's wonderful, But at the end of the day, we wouldn't be talking about a spiritual journey if we didn't actually have personal experiences of that focal point. And that's only going to, and by prayer, I simply mean where you believe you are somehow able to experience or communicate with, and you use whatever word you want. But that's what I would say. I would say, and I can email you the name, but Rovelli, R-O-V-E-L-L-I. Let him lead you through the fascinating labyrinthine ways of cutting edge physics today. And then just bring that into your toolbox. And I think you'll find that's a very rich way of exploring, rather than some of the voluminous books about, I've seen things like, did Jesus go through a wormhole at the resurrection? And just nutty stuff, but people take that very seriously.
I have a gift for you. I need podium, so I want to present you with this wonderful cup, our Rotary Club of Chicago, and you will receive in the mail some cookies from Al's Cookie Mix. Alvin Green started a cookie company to assist his son and their friends who have autism to have jobs once they have aged out of the CPS system. So you'll get some wonderful cookies in the mail from them as a thank you for coming. You're welcome. And thank you so much for such a thought-provoking speaking today. We'd like to thank all of our guests that came today. We really enjoyed having you and hope to see you again here soon. In our upcoming events next week, we have Arnie Duncan, the managing director of Creed. They work toward helping to stop gun violence in Chicago, so he will be here next week. And then we have David Goldberg, who is the managing director of the Anti-Defamation League, and he will be here on June 11th. We will not have a meeting the first week of June because of the international conference. We have some people there, so we're going to take that week off. And my favorite day of this year, Sarah Buck. Please join us for the installation of Sarah Buck, our president-elect, on June 25th at 11:30 here at the Union League Club. Sarah is an amazing teacher at Chicago State University, and I am humbled to have served before her and can't wait to serve with her and assist her in her year. So please come out and help celebrate that. The Rotary International President-elect Stephanie Urchek will be here to induct her as president of our club, the 122nd president. These are all of our amazing international service projects that we have done that have been approved this year, and there are so many more. And this is some of the work that we do around the world here, and then some of the many things I mentioned earlier that we do here in Chicago. So if you have any questions or you want to be a part of any of these wonderful projects, Tom Silva in the back, one of the co-chairs, Shada, the outgoing chair, Marga and Katie Hanlon will gladly have you come and be a part of the committee. And Job One, this is our signature project where we recruit Chicago high school juniors and seniors, and we get them meaningful employment. We have a job fair coming up in about 2 weeks, and so we need employers to come out and want to hire our wonderful students, but we also need employers to come out and help them learn interview skills. So also part of that job fair is to just help them put in all the skills that we taught them over the last 3 weeks into action and learn how to go through an interview and ask the right questions and be prepared. So even if you can't hire a student this year, we would love for you to still come out and be a part of the job fair and help us get them those great interview skills so that they're ready once they leave college. and donate to the Rotary Foundation and the Rotary One Foundation. This is how we do all the amazing work that we do in the community and around the world. Without your donations, we aren't able to do that. So please feel free to donate into the lovely piggy banks on the table toward our foundation, or you can also go to the website or call the office and they will gladly take your donation. And then we have Rotary Means Business, which meets the first Monday of every month at Cafe Chow at 5:30. So come out, meet other Rotarians, meet non-Rotarians. We strive to network in a different way, more relationship building and talking to each other and learning why we're all there and how we can all do business together with like-minded people. That's how Rotary was started, was businessmen who wanted to come together and do service, but also work with like-minded people that had the same thoughts and values that they had. We have our roundtable every Friday. We meet on the 4th floor at noon. It is come out and fellowship and network and meet tons of international guests that always come in and drop in. So please feel free to come to that. And then today, Tom Silva graciously helped us get this wonderful speaker today. So if you have an idea for an amazing speaker that you would love to have here at the club, please reach out to Eric Kemple or the office so that we can work together to get them on the schedule. And with that, if we could all stand for the 4-way test of the things we think, say, or do. Number 1, is it the truth? Number 2, is it fair to all concerned? Number 3, better friendships. And number 4, will be beneficial to all concerned. And number 5, will it be fun? And with that, I adjourn the meeting.